Welcome to Wetpixel Live. I'm Adam Hanlon. I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and we'd like to thank Aquatica for sponsoring this episode. Aquatica do a lot of housings, ports, arms and accessories, and also video housings under the Amphibico brand. So please head on over to aquatica.ca to check out what they do. And I'm joined today by our regular contributor, Alex Mustard. Hi, Alex.
Hey, Adam. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Um, Obviously, there's always trends in underwater photography in technique in terms of popular techniques, and it seems that the next big technique probably is going to be wide-angle macro as a sort of a genre of imagery that's produced. So, with that in mind, I thought I'd ask Alex for what equipment he uses for wide-angle macro and some principles in terms of setting the gear up. So, yeah, go on, Alex.
I do agree with you that, like all these things, wide angle macro has always been around in underwater photography. Certainly since lenses were invented that were able to focus close enough to be able to do the technique.
Yep.
But I think it's got a real possibility. I think it's the most likely thing to become a big widespread trend now.
Yep.
I think the destinations that suit it, those classic macro destinations, are incredibly popular. And I think a lot of photographers are looking for new types of images to take in that place. And I think wide angle macro is great for that environmental shot of putting an animal in its habitat, telling a bigger story about it, a grander tale. So I think for me, I see it really likely to become very popular. And it also happens to be, there's some really exciting new equipment available that I think changes our capabilities in that area. Before going through some of the specific options for camera gear when shooting wide angle macro, I think it's important to understand what are the requirements lens wise, in terms of your optical system to make wide angle macro. And obviously you need a wide angle lens, and for it to be able to shoot a subject in a macro level of magnification, it needs to be able to focus really, really, really close. Now, to make that work underwater, what you need a lens that can focus really close, but you need to have it working behind the smallest front element possible. So typically that's a dome port, but if it's a lens that doesn't need a dome port, that front element needs to be as small as possible. As soon as it gets sort of bigger than this, even if your subject is sitting against it, your macro subject will remain small in the picture. And the aim of a wide angle macro picture is to have your macro subject filling the frame like it would in a normal macro shot. So as a result, you need a small front element so that macro subject can therefore be reproduced big in the picture.
So I think we probably should define wide angle macro, Alex. So go on and try and, I mean, obviously these definitions are difficult, but what would you define? What's the difference between a wide angle image, macro image, and a wide angle macro image? What is a wide angle macro image actually about?
Well, wide angle macro is basically shooting a macro subject, so a subject with macro levels of magnification that we, as normal underwater photographers, would consider a macro level, magnification, but with a wide angle lens, placing that subject in a wide angle view. So it's, yes, you could shoot these shots and just with a wide lens, but it's really about placing a subject in its context, in its environment. And because you're shooting that with a wide angle lens, your main subject leaps out of the picture, your macro subject, and your background recedes back. So you get a feeling of the environment without it overpowering the picture.
And typically the background obviously is visible. So unlike a macro, there are ways of macro techniques where we can allow some of the background to come in, but normally it's blurred or something else. This obviously you will actually see some level of detail in the background. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but it's really about shooting a macro subject with a wide angle lens, but in a way that gives you a macro level of magnification on the subject, so that you get that same great macro subject filling the frame, but instead of having a blurred or a black background, you've got an environmental background to place it in. So on the equipment front, I think the key thing really for me is that you have that small front element because it allows you to get that magnification. But you also, equipment-wise, need a relatively compact system. The smaller your camera system, the smaller the footprint of the camera system, the easier it is to get your lighting on the subject. And actually, the big challenge of wide-angle macro isn't really getting a lens really close to a subject. It's being able to get good light on that subject when you are there.
Yep.
And that is made a whole lot easier when your camera rig is smaller. If you have a great big camera rig like this and you're trying to shoot something right in front of it like this, it's very difficult to get the light round the camera rig onto the subject.
Yep.
If you have a small camera rig, or you have a camera rig that the front element sticks out a long way, much easier then to get your lighting in and around that subject and light the subject. So you can do wide angle macro with lots and lots and lots of different lens choices. And I think when I gave my recent talk on it, I think I went through something like 14 different options that people can use for wide angle macro.
Yeah.
But the lenses that are suitable for it, and that's what the 14 came from, are ones that give you this ability to shrink your system down, or to have something that sticks out a little bit and therefore pull the lighting in, because it's the lighting that really makes these shots. If you know the lens is seeing the front of the subject,
Yep.
And if you're not able to light the front of the subject, the lens is going to be disappointed by what it's seeing.
Yep.
And so being able to get your light round the camera onto the front of that subject makes a really big difference. And that's quite difficult to do when everything is so small and so close.
And I think this is a mistake that people often make with, they'll use a conventional sized dome, a largish dome, which is what we normally shoot with. And there's no way that you're going to get the strobes round the edges of that dome. It's not physically possible. There's too much dome in the way. This is certainly, I think, one of the key probably considerations when we're talking about gear, isn't it? Is having the ability to pull the lights in close enough. Yeah.
But also with the cameras, the housings as well. Anything you can do to reduce the footprint size of your housing is good, So choosing to work with a relatively small camera and housing is obviously really great for this type of system. But also, if you've got a big housing, think about, do you really, could you take your handles off the housing this dive? Because being able to get your strobes that much closer, because you haven't got handles on the side of your housing, makes a really big difference for lighting for wide angle macro. This is a technique all about extremes. The more you can push everything to the extreme, the more impressive your shots become.
Yeah.
And all those little tweaks make a really big difference.
And
so
I think,
I was going to.
And forgive me for diverting, but strobe size too is also critical, isn't it? So,
I'm not so sure about that. You definitely don't want long strobes because they just get in the way.
Yeah.
But what I find is the problem with wide angle macro is because you're working so close to the subject, unless you've got a pretty good quality of light from your strobes, the light looks really harsh and ugly.
Yeah.
And so you actually need quite good strobes. I, for a while, tried doing this technique using some small strobes, thinking that would help me miniaturize my system. And ultimately, I went back to the bigger strobes because I was always disappointed with the quality of light. Yeah. So, it's less important shrinking the strobes as it is shrinking everything else.
I think maybe shape of strobes maybe more what I was thinking about rather than physical size.
I think actually the length doesn't really, because the usual setup is that you have your lens in the middle, and if your housing sticks out wide like this, whether your strobes are long or short, you can't get them in there. So actually, I don't think it would actually make that much difference on it, because it's actually really about if you can get your housing to squash in that way, that makes the biggest difference of all, because ultimately your port is unlikely to stick out too far. Yeah. So in terms of the different systems, the first piece of advice I'd say is it's easier to do wide angle macro with camera systems with smaller sensors. The bigger your sensor, the more you're fighting against the big challenge of wide angle macro, which is depth of field. Yep. So I personally like to use, for this technique, some of the smaller sensor cameras, but I'll run through some options for the different cameras. If you're on full frame cameras, the lenses to use are close focusing fisheye lenses. Yep. You can't use direct to linear lenses because if you put them behind a small dome port, the image quality goes rubbish. So even though there are lenses like the Laowa 15mm macro lens, which is a wide angle macro lens on land, underwater, it's perfect until you stop putting it behind a dome port. And as soon as you put it behind a small dome port, it's useless because the image quality goes in the corners. The fisheyes will put up with that small dome port much better. And it's that small dome port that gives you that small front element that makes everything else possible. So on a full frame cameras, the 8-15 lenses are really the way to go, and you can use those on the mirrorlesses and on the SLRs. And you use those with as small a dome port as you can. One thing I like about the 8-15s is you can take that lens hood off, which allows you to get it really close to that front element of the dome. And the smallest dome you can source, the better. A lot of the small domes are 100mm or 4 inches. I actually have a 3-inch dome, which I use for these shots, and every little bit helps.
Yeah.
So whatever you can do to find a smaller dome, it'll improve the shots. And on the crop sensor cameras, I would say the 10 to 17 is a very good lens for this technique for the same reason.
Yeah.
In both those cases, you can use that lens on a teleconverter if you want. The advantage of the teleconverter is that it narrows the angle of view a bit, which can sometimes be helpful, but it also pushes the lens out further from the camera, which helps you get your lighting in. And it's why the relatively physically long 8 to 15 lenses are really good for this technique, much better than, say, a Sigma 15mm prime, because that lens is so small on a full frame camera. It means that your dome port is right up against your housing, makes it get you harder to get your lighting in. Whereas the extra barrel length of an 8 to 15, particularly on a teleconverter, gives you a little bit longer lens sticking out, and it allows you to get the lighting in. And you can see where I'm going with all of that, is that ability to get the lens out away from the camera makes makes the lighting so much easier. And that is one of the main strengths of a system like the EN-WL1, Nauticam's new wide angle macro lens, which for me is the gold standard of this technique, which I'm sort of building up towards. And the advantage of that lens is not only does it stick out a long way, but you can also change the front elements of it underwater, so to change your angle of view. You don't need to use the middle section of the EN-WL1 if you don't want to, but if you don't use that middle section, your picture is upside down. And that isn't actually that difficult to work with. And particularly if you want to work some more interesting camera angles, it's good. I was shooting tadpoles in the pond the other day, baby frogs or baby toads that were actually in the pond. And for that, because I was basically shooting blind, there was no point putting that middle section on. So, if you're going to shoot, if you're not going to look through the viewfinder and you're just going to shoot blind, then, why have that middle section on the EM-WL1? I have to say, one of the problems I've been having with the EM-WL1, getting completely sidetracked now, in those more murky conditions, is that in those conditions, it's very hard to get the water inside the sections of the EM-WL1 without getting all the muck in there as well. And I think Nauticam need to make some sort of
injection
condom
system.
Which so you can fill it up in clear water and then lock the clear water inside the EM-WL1.
There you go.
And then I don't it was really troublesome in murky water, because one blob of sediment in one of those sections and it blocks an annoying amount of light.
And of course, the moment you lift the lens out in the water drains out, doesn't it? So it's not as if you can go somewhere and fill it and then bring it in. Yeah.
Obviously, not a condom you don't want the condom to go over the end of it. It needs some thought anyway. I'm not quite that kind of. I think they're called gaskets, aren't they? Things like those things.
Well, I think you could probably inner tube. I was thinking actually strips of inner tube.
Yeah. But I think you need something that clamps either side of each joint.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
Put on in the bath at home, so it's all nice, fill up with clear water. Anyway, I'm getting very sidetracked. So moving on to some of the other systems, I'm a really big fan of using some of the smaller sensor size cameras for this type of shooting. And I particularly like using my Micro Four Thirds camera for wide angle macro with a small dome port. I use it with the Panasonic 8mm fisheye, because that's the fisheye I've got, and that makes a lovely small system. Particularly if you take the handles off the housing. Those housings can be really small, the Micro Four Thirds cameras, when they haven't got massive great handles on the sides. And that really shrinks the system down for this type of shooting. And I mount my strobes off the central ball on the top of the housing with a three-way clamp. So I've got a really nice compact rig. And that's actually one of my preferred choices. You could do the same with compact cameras. And I think Enon make a very nice wide angle macro fisheye lens for the compact cameras that's very good for this, because it's got a really small front element. But I do think that the image quality is a little bit lacking in that system. Great for Facebook, not so good for being published with. And that is one of the challenges with quite a few of these systems. So for me, the sweet spot is more in the Micro Four Thirds area than it is in the compact cameras, because the imaging quality from those compact cameras is not good enough. And if you go for a compact camera with a really big sensor, you suddenly throw away all the advantages of using a compact camera in the first place. So the Micro Four Thirds for me is the sweet spot on lens.
I think one of the great advantages as well about smaller, obviously, and when we're diving together, you'll quite often dive with your main camera set up for conventional macro or whatever you're shooting, and then dive with your micro four thirds set up for wide angle macro, and you can carry both systems because the one system is very small and compact, or alternatively give that to a dive guide and they can look after it, or whatever may be the case. It's very portable, and that means it's great because it means when you've got opportunities which you won't have necessarily every dive, you're ready there to take advantage of those opportunities. And I think there's a lot to be said for this idea of actually specializing, getting a system that you specialize for wide angle macro, rather than trying to tailor your system, your existing bigger system possibly to it. I think it's a real mileage.
Yeah, and I think if you look financially, for example, I'd say the gold standard solution is the EM WL1. Lens from Nauticam, but for the price of that lens, which is expensive, you could buy a whole second system. A relatively low end micro four thirds camera designed around doing this for less than that lens. And that's really worth considering from a travel weight point of view as well. That camera is not adding a great deal to your luggage allowance compared to it probably weighs less than the EMWL1 with all the bits you need to make it work. I have to say though that for me, what's so exciting about the EMWL1 is it really is the easiest to use, the most flexible to use, the best image quality that I've used of these systems. And, maybe there'll be more accessories for it in the future as well. So I think that would be the way to go. But because it's expensive, one thing I'd say to a lot of underwater photographers who've asked me about it is that you don't necessarily need to buy one yourself. It's a really good thing to maybe get 2 of you or 4 of you together and buy one. And if you're all diving together locally, it's not a lens you'd use every dive anyway. So why not share it around amongst the group? If one of you's got a big trip, they have it for the trip. And then the next of you's got a big trip, they have it for the trip. Or if you're doing the trip together, you take it on the trip and you share it across the dives. But the thing I've found with that lens is I've found because you've got the flexibility of the end pieces, I've found a lot more subject suited. Whereas when I shoot wide angle macro in, say, on a muck dive in Asia, maybe you do a whole dive and you find 1 or 2 suitable subjects for it because it's quite a specific technique. When I've been shooting the MWL1 and it's mainly been in the UK because of the sort of diving that I've been doing, I've found a lot more I can shoot with it because of its way it works. And I found that too with a little bit of tropical diving I did with it before the pandemic hit us. That I was finding, a lot of subjects that I would never consider a wide angle macro subject, I was suddenly able to shoot as a wide angle macro because that lens is so easy to use.
I quite agree. I mean, I again limited experience like you with it, but shooting even shooting fish feeding and stuff like that on the bottom in UK conditions, and it's coming up with great results, actually very unique results, and that to me that struck me as being that's it, you're going to get this perspective, this completely different perspective, which I think is very exciting as well. It's it is the whole I suppose that's the sort of endoscopic element to it, but it's
and I think that for me is the key to wide angle macro. It's really a way to diversify your macro portfolio. I would never stop shooting normal macro. In fact, I've done the last 14 UK dives I've done only 2 of them with the wide angle macro, but it was really good, on those 2 dives. But I got so much from those 2 dives, it was kind of like, well, I don't need to do more of it. I've got more than enough shots. I'll go back to standard macro. So that's how it's kind of fitting into my shooting. It's a really important part of my portfolio at the moment, but it's not actually taking up that many of my dives because I find it so, I can quite quickly get good shots of all the subjects that I think it's suitable for.
And it's interesting. I mean, I think EMWL has probably changed the workflow a bit as well, hasn't it? It's made you get in, you get the shots, whereas previously you might have had to take a few dives to figure out how to do it. So for sure, wonderful. So Alex has been posting wide angle macro shots on his Instagram at, remind me, Alex please.
Mustard 1 on Instagram.
Alex Mustard 1, and there's some wonderful shots from the UK with EMWL and wide angle macro. So go on, head on over and check him out. Thank you very much, Alex. And again, we'd like to thank Quastra again for sponsoring this episode. Really appreciate their support. And thank you all for watching. Please feel free to add any comments in the comment section or to drop us a like if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again soon.